Thank you very much. The two of us presenting today, myself, I'm Anthony Kent. I'm Professor of Fashion Marketing, but my first degree, and this is why this event was very interesting, was taken in modern history at the University of Oxford. So I think some of the discussion we've had so far will follow on very well from some rather bigger issues I'm going to talk to. And my colleague, Alberta St. James, is a Ph.D. student working at the Nottingham Trent University, and her study is in upcycling and fashion waste in Ghana. Yeah. So I'm going to start by moving on straight away to discussion of disruption. So it does follow on very well from our previous speaker, and to consider that disruption is very rarely the focus of fashion research. But first of all, we need a consideration, in addition to our colleague's previous presentation, about what are disruptions and what we can learn from them on a larger scale, what should be disordered, and what should be the aim of the disruption, because it implies that we reorder the fashion industry or parts of it in some desired way. Because disruptions change the status quo by definition, routines, ways of working and living at localized and personalized levels, and at a more abstract level in terms of economics, society, culture, politics, and religion. They're an upheaval that can take place quickly. As Michael Howard pointed out, wars start when at least two sides decide to take a course of action which sets off a train of events, but they develop over time. A revolution can be equally disruptive on a localized level, at a national level, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, but a revolution can also be geographically dispersed across industries. So the Industrial Revolution was something that changed centuries-old working practices, technologies, and economies, leading to mass prosperity in the 20th century. However, a recent review of history of disruptions point to a further dimension, and that's to do with disruption in a technological sense, first described in 1995 in the Harvard Business Review, whereby companies could disrupt other companies by using resources in a different way. And I think we've become very used to understanding disruptive technology and the power of innovation, in terms of the power of innovation, as an important role, taking an important role in change in many Western countries as well as organizations, and resulting in new ideas and new developments such as Apple, iPhone, and Netflix. I should also make three other points here. Firstly, disruptions can have creative outcomes, so we can think of a renaissance or renaissances as the outcome of disruptive forces and creatively inspire new outgoings. And the second and third points are that they can arise from non-natural causes, non-man-made causes, naturally from disease or natural disasters that can change the ways in which we work and dislocate the fashion supply chain, for example. And the third aspect is they're not exclusively European, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And Ian King, just a minute ago, mentioned the Silk Road, and Peter Frankopan, in a recent book, demonstrated how Chinese, Indian, and Arabic disruptions over many centuries have affected our trade in fashion with the Far East. This talk isn't specifically about heritage either, and I'm going to define heritage as a version of the past received through objects on display, representations, engagement, spectacular locations and events, memories and commemorations for the preparation of cultural purposes and consumption. But I think here, the point here is that heritage is actually designed or used to build connections rather than disrupt. When it gets into commercial usage, then it becomes problematic altogether. I think we see these problems of it being rather pernicious, pervasive, and often rather too shallow, and having to address these issues of whose heritage is it. Well, that also could be applied to history, of course. But history, when we think about it, its application in fashion has really emerged from studies of dress and textiles. As Jens noted in 2016, these began in the 1970s and 80s, and they arose really from material culture and cultural perspectives. And over the years, there have been problems really noted by scholars coming from a number of directions that we haven't really integrated them into other forms of study. The interdisciplinary aspect has been rather neglected. So today I'm hoping I plan to look at three lenses. The first one really is to do with interpretation. The second one is to do with the influence of digital, and the third with non-Western influence. So interpretation, what I'm really calling for here is a look at interdisciplinary research. and a return to the archives. If we're going to address the problem of disruption and one of history and how can history disrupt, we have to return to the archives in all sorts of different ways. And perhaps use all sorts of historical schools of thought and ways of approaching it. For example, Ferdinand Brouzel's discussion of the French Annales approach to history that emerged in the mid-20th century is very valuable in terms of emerging a traditional humanistic approach with methods from other disciplines, creating scholarship of an interdisciplinary character. Likewise, we could think about Thomas Kuhn's work in science on the importance of paradigms and how we might understand past paradigms of fashion and the ways they disrupt and change over the years. Part of the problem we have with history and fashion studies is the problem of periodization. Cecil Beaton in 1950s rather flippantly observed that wars really changed dress codes and attitudes to dress, but we're left with this in a rather more serious way as a legacy in many fashion studies. At least at our university, history of fashion is divided up into 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. It's not a very sophisticated way of approaching it. But I'd just like to say a word now on how we might approach it in a interdisciplinary way from a few examples from organizational studies and management studies in particular. McLean, Harvey and Clegg, for example, in 2016, said that what we need is work that is rigorous as history, but also helps to build and redefine history, business history in a social science sense. The challenge for organization studies is to integrate history and theory, overcoming a aversion to theory by historians and neglect of historical processes by organization theories. Over in the business studies area as well, project management has been very fruitful, and people have applied, or researchers have applied historical techniques to business management, and we could think about project management, and we could think about these in terms of fashion as well. How could fashion industry disruptions be studied through strategies, for example? Why did firms choose a strategy and visualize their futures, and how did this strategy evolve once it was put into practice? Another example, network dynamics, firms that are growing, dying, all sorts of competitive dynamics. My second point is digital world, and I've said already that disruption in the digital world is well known, disruptive technologies. But two particular points here that we might need to consider in the future: curation of collections of fashion stuff in a different way, and how we conceptualize the archive of the future and the past. New sources and types of data sets are available to all sorts of people, and consumers have become incessant generators of structured data. And they become both critics and content curators. So what would be the archive of the future, and how would we mine into this as historians and understand the disruptive nature of these different types of curating activity? But I'll pass over to Alberta to talk now about the disruptive possibilities for non-Western fashion.
Sure. I think the third lens in support of Tony's point is to use non-Western fashion and histories to really disrupt the way the Westerners view fashion. You know, Jennings and Udu take the view that Africa is the new fashion frontier. Therefore, you know, things like looking at the creative process of how, you know, for example, Africans think about fashion. How do we view, how can artifacts, African artifacts, be incorporated into fashion? And these, I believe, they do have a huge potential in influencing how, you know, fashion can be developed into future thinking. I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And then, so finally, in conclusion, we'll just take a few points that we've raised already. History provides us a context and examples to help think about and make sense of a complicated world. It warns us about assuming ways of looking at things and one course of action. As Macmillan in 2010 proposed, it encourages a skeptical frame of mind and teaches us humility, skepticism, and awareness of ourselves. Historians can reinforce previous narratives, but more often challenge things said before, bringing in new insights and perspectives. Our ability to understand and learn from disruptions in history requires a specific agenda to explore disruption. A number of historical building blocks exist, but we can learn more from more rigorous forms of interdisciplinary historical inquiry. the building of collaborations and networks with internationally renowned history departments, the engagement with business, economic and social historians could place fashion in a wider context. This paper suggests that an approach that examines history, the history of the disruptive power of digital technologies and media in particular, can create new forms of archive to inform and inspire fashion. How we have curated and the emerging forms of curation, who curates, and what the collection should be are part of this assessment. We should also develop a more coherent and challenging approach to global fashion and how the histories of fashion can disrupt the conventions of a Western-centered fashion industry. How have other societies and cultures sustained fashion, for example? So in summary, one outcome of this colloquium may be a new project for disruption in fashion. Thank you.